Imagine you're standing right in front of the Great Pyramids of Giza.
Right.
You're staring up at these ancient, towering mountains of stone, marveling at, the sheer permanence of them. And then the person standing next to you just casually points at the largest pyramid and says, in a few years, every single one of those massive stones is going to be completely dismantled.
Like nothing left.
Right. Until there is absolutely nothing left. You'd look at them like they had completely lost their mind.
Oh, absolutely. It fundamentally breaks the brain's understanding of permanence, really.
It really does. And that is exactly the kind of cognitive bombshell we're exploring for you today.
Right, because today we're unpacking Mark chapter 13, which is, often considered the most notoriously difficult and intense chapter in the New Testament.
Definitely. And for this deep dive, we're grounding our analysis in an audio lecture by David Pawson, along with excerpts from a study guide called The King's Return.
Yeah, and both of these sources just dive headfirst into this text, which is, well, it's famous for these dire apocalyptic predictions.
I mean, we're talking cosmic events, the destruction of monumental structures, global turmoil. To a modern listener, it sounds like, the screenplay for a massive Hollywood disaster film.
It really does, yeah. But we should clarify, our mission for this deep dive isn't to satisfy idle curiosity or try to put a pin on a calendar to predict the end of the world.
Right. We're going to look impartially at the historical and religious claims made in these sources, not to endorse them or preach them, but just to decode the underlying psychology. Yeah.
Exactly. We want to understand what the sources argue is actually a highly practical blueprint, a blueprint for how you can live a deeply engaged, faithful life right now in the present.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to get to that practical blueprint, we have to look at what the disciples thought was permanent in the present.
Right. We have to understand the psychological shock of that pyramid analogy you just used. Because in the text, Jesus and his disciples are walking away from the temple in Jerusalem.
Built by King Herod, right?
Yes, built by Herod. And to really grasp the disciples' reaction, we have to understand the mind-boggling scale of this structure.
Oh, the sources really dwell on the physical logistics here. Like, this wasn't just a large building. It was an engineering marvel that covered an area the size of multiple modern sports stadiums combined.
Just massive.
Right, sitting right there in the Judean hills. It was built with brilliant white stone, and massive sections were completely plated in solid gold.
Yeah, the lecture actually points out it was specifically designed to reflect the morning sun so intensely that it would literally blind you.
Wow, literally blind you if you look directly at it.
Exactly. And the individual building blocks, I mean, they were incomprehensible. We were talking about single foundation stones measuring 40 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 18 feet high.
Wait, single stones?
Single stones weighing over 100 tons.
That is just wild. So when the disciples are pointing at this, they aren't just admiring nice architecture.
No, not at all. They're looking at the ultimate symbol of their national identity, their religion, what they believed was the literal, permanent dwelling place of God.
Which is why the pushback to Jesus's prediction is so visceral. Because he looks at this impenetrable fortress of 100-ton stones and tells them not one stone will be left upon another.
It completely defies all human logic.
Totally. If you're a disciple hearing that, you're not just thinking about a building falling down, your entire worldview is collapsing. The study guide brings in this brilliant comparison here to the Titanic.
Oh yeah, the Titanic analogy is perfect.
Right. In 1912, people truly believed the Titanic was unsinkable purely because of its sheer mass and modern engineering. The disciples viewed the temple the exact same way.
Because human beings have this psychological gravity, I'd call it. It pulls us toward putting our ultimate trust in impressive, visible structures.
Yeah, we anchor our security to physical buildings, to massive institutions, economic systems.
Exactly. And by predicting the absolute flattening of this seemingly eternal structure, the sources argue Jesus was aggressively forcing a psychological pivot. He was redirecting their reliance away from temporary human achievement.
And pointing them toward eternal realities. But the disciples, they immediately panic.
Naturally. They pull him aside privately and ask, when? When will this happen?
And that single question uncovers a massive framework, doesn't it? Like, it dictates how the rest of this text operates.
It really does. Because they're asking a question based on a complete misunderstanding of how historical time works in these ancient prophecies.
They assume that if the temple falls, it must mean the literal end of the space-time continuum.
Right. To them, the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the world are the exact same event.
So to untangle this, the lecture introduces this critical concept called the prophetic telescope. Let me make sure I'm translating this telescope concept correctly for the listener. Because it's kind of like looking at a photograph of a mountain range where you have zero depth perception. You see two massive mountain peaks, and in a 2D photo, they look like they're right next to each other, basically touching.
Yeah, they look totally flat.
Right. But if you actually hike to the top of the first peak, you suddenly realize there's a massive hidden valley, maybe hundreds or thousands of miles across between the first mountain and the second mountain.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. The telescope tells you what is out there, but it completely obscures the distance between the events.
Right.
And the sources point out that Old Testament prophets operated this way constantly. They would describe, say, the first coming of a Messiah and a final apocalyptic judgment in the exact same breath.
Seeing the two peaks together despite a massive gap of time in between.
Exactly. And Jesus is utilizing that exact same prophetic telescope here in Mark 13. He's looking at two distinct peaks.
The first being the very real historical fall of Jerusalem, which we know happened in AD 70.
Right. And the second peak being the ultimate end of the world.
Which means there is a massive valley between those two events. If you're listening to this, you are technically living in that valley right now.
We are in the valley.
So what do the sources say that journey through the valley is supposed to look like? Because Jesus doesn't paint a particularly comforting picture here.
No, he doesn't. What's fascinating here is how brutally honest he is about it. The text outlines 3 specific severe perils that will define this interim period. First, he warns that minds will be deeply disturbed by spiritual deception.
Specifically, false prophets, right?
Exactly.
The lecture brings up a fascinating historical anchor for this, a figure named Bar Kokhba.
Oh, right.
Before the eventual fall of Jerusalem, when the political tension with Rome was at its absolute breaking point, this man rose to power claiming to be the Messiah. He capitalized on public desperation, promised military victory over the Romans, and just led thousands of people astray into slaughter.
Which is exactly the warning. This mechanism of charlatans weaponizing a crisis to manipulate desperate people, it's going to be a constant feature of the valley.
What?
Following that, the second peril shifts to the physical world. Hearts will be disturbed by global, systemic turmoil. Wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines.
But the theological argument here is crucial to understand, because usually when people see massive global tragedies, the immediate reaction is, God has lost control, or this is the absolute end.
Right, but the study guide reframes this completely, using the analogy of childbirth contractions.
Yes. When a mother experiences the intense pain of labor, the pain isn't a signal of death or chaos. It's the biological mechanism signaling that something new is arriving.
History isn't just randomly spiraling out of control. These sources argue that historical disasters are essentially global birth pains.
Painfully convulsing its way toward an appointed conclusion.
Exactly. But that reframing requires immense psychological endurance, and they need that endurance for the third peril. Severe, relentless persecution.
From all sides, right.
From literally every direction. Universal hatred from the culture, political trials in front of governors, religious beatings within their own synagogues, and most devastatingly, domestic betrayal, where family members turn against each other for survival.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is what strikes me as so profoundly counterintuitive. Jesus didn't recruit followers by promising them, health, wealth, and a stress-free life.
Not at all.
He basically promises them a severe, grueling reality, a jolly tough time. But he pairs that suffering with a singular, non-negotiable mission. The sources emphasize there is one absolute prerequisite that must be fulfilled before the end can actually arrive.
Right. The gospel must be preached to all nations, and the lecture dives into the sheer logistical magnitude of that prerequisite.
It's massive.
It is. There are roughly 4,600 major languages and dialects globally. Currently, the Bible has been translated into about 2,600 of them.
That leaves an enormous gap.
A huge gap. But there are organizations, like the Wycliffe Bible Translators based in Surrey, dedicating entire lifetimes to decoding those remaining 2,000 languages.
It comes with extreme risk. The lecture cites that famous story of the Auca Indians in 1952.
The missionaries who were martyred.
Exactly. The secular world looked at that tragedy and asked, Why on earth would you go there? What a waste.
But the theological perspective of the sources argues those missionaries weren't thrill seekers. They were consciously trying to fulfill this exact historical prerequisite.
It's an ongoing relay race across generations. You take the baton as far as you can and you hand it off to the next runner.
So if the valley is defined by this grueling relay race through turmoil and persecution, let's look at the first major obstacle on that journey. We are zooming back into the telescope to look at the first mountain peak.
The fall of Jerusalem in AD 70.
Right. This is where the historical mechanics get incredibly tense. Jesus gives his followers a highly specific, very strange warning sign for when the temple's about to fall.
The desolating sacrilege, or the abomination of desolation, which to a modern ear is basically meaningless.
Totally meaningless to us today. But to a first-century Jewish audience, it triggered deeply traumatic historical memories. The sources explain this as a direct callback to the book of Daniel.
Oh, right, when the Greeks invaded.
Exactly. The Jewish people remembered when the Greeks previously invaded Jerusalem, marched into the sacred temple, erected a statue of the Greek god Zeus, and sacrificed a pig on the holy altar.
The ultimate calculated defilement of their most sacred space.
So Jesus is essentially giving them a historical pattern recognition test.
He's saying, when you see the geopolitical machine gearing up to do that exact thing again, drop everything and run.
Yes, run immediately.
In fact, the Gospel of Mark includes a parenthetical note right in the text. Let the reader understand. It's almost like a coded wink to the audience, right? Because Mark was writing this down right around AD 60 to 64, just a few years before the siege actually happened.
And the timeline aligns perfectly. By AD 70, the Roman military machine surrounded Jerusalem. The legions carried their imperial eagles and statues of the emperor, fully intending to place them inside the temple to assert total dominance.
But the Romans utilized a peculiar military tactic, didn't they?
They did. Before closing the siege lines completely, they offered a brief grace period. Traffic could still technically move in and out of the city gates.
And this grace period forces a massive, tragic divergence in how people responded.
Yes, a really stark contrast.
The Christians, remembering this specific warning from Mark's text, didn't hesitate. They recognized the pattern, abandoned their homes immediately, and fled across the Jordan River to a city called Pella.
And the historical record indicates that effectively 0 Christians died in the siege.
0. But let me ask you this. If Jesus gave them the exact signs in the timeline he said this generation, why did so many run the wrong way?
Well, because the broader Jewish population made the opposite calculation, operating under that illusion of permanence we discussed earlier. They believed the physical stones of the temple would supernaturally protect them.
They thought God would never allow his own house to be destroyed.
Exactly. So instead of fleeing the advancing army, refugees from the entire surrounding countryside poured into Jerusalem, locking themselves inside what they thought was an impenetrable vault.
And the ancient historian Josephus documented the aftermath. The details are genuinely horrifying.
Beyond horrifying.
With hundreds of thousands of extra people trapped inside the walls during a prolonged Roman blockade, the city simply starved to death. 1.1 million people perished.
The sources recount how citizens were reduced to eating animal dung, boiling their own leather shoes for sustenance.
And eventually resorting to cannibalism, consuming their own children. And when the Romans finally breached the walls, they slaughtered the weakened survivors and took 97,000 people back to Rome as slaves.
The cognitive dissonance is staggering. They had the warnings. As you said, Jesus even provided a timeline for this specific event, stating this generation will not pass away before it happens.
Which was accurate. It occurred roughly 40 years later.
Right. But they tragically chose to place their absolute faith in the physical engineering of a doomed building, rather than the prophetic warning of an impending collapse.
It's the ultimate cautionary tale about what we choose to trust. And if you're following the logical thread of the text, it creates a terrifying proposition.
How so?
Well, if Jesus' predictions about that first peak, the utter annihilation of Jerusalem in AD 70 were that chillingly historically accurate, it forces you to take a very hard look at what the sources say about the second peak. The literal end of the world.
Right. The transition to the second peak involves a massive shift in scale. We move from local geopolitics to cosmic unraveling.
The sources detail specific cosmic signs, right? The sun going dark, stars falling from the sky.
Yeah, the lecture notes a linguistic and theological tie here to the Old Testament prophet Joel and the events of Pentecost, specifically predicting that the moon will fail to give its light, turning a deep blood red.
It sounds utterly terrifying, but then the text pivots from this cosmic destruction to a moment of supreme reunion. the gathering of the elect in the air.
Yes, and I love the poignant story the lecturer shared to humanize this concept. The speaker talks about visiting his grandfather's gravestone up in Newcastle.
Oh, right, because usually you expect a somber rest in peace or some stoic Bible verse.
But his grandfather's inscription was simply 3 words: "What a meeting."
What a meeting. That perfectly captures the emotional transition here, moving the listener from a state of apocalyptic terror to one of profound, eager anticipation.
It really does. But here's the most critical pivot in the entire chapter, and it's where almost everyone gets tripped up. Unlike the fall of Jerusalem, where Jesus gave a clear chronological marker of this generation, he establishes a hard, impenetrable boundary regarding the end of the world.
Right. He states unequivocally that absolutely no one knows the day or the hour.
Not the angels in heaven, not even the Son himself, but only the Father.
Let me stop you there, because human psychology fundamentally rejects that boundary. We hate not knowing. Hasn't history been full of people trying to put a date on this?
Oh, a continuous parade of people ignoring that exact sentence.
Yeah.
Brilliant historical minds, people like Martin Luther and John Wesley, who the lecturer points out tried and completely failed to calculate the date.
Entire religious sects constantly pop up based on a charismatic leader claiming they cracked the math on the apocalypse.
And every single one of them fails because they attempt to bypass a divine restriction. The compulsion to mathematically calculate the end is essentially an attempt to control the uncontrollable.
Right.
But the sources argue that this restriction isn't a puzzle to be solved. It is a deliberate feature of the theology.
So what does this all mean? If the listener is explicitly forbidden from knowing the exact timeline of the end, how are they supposed to actually live their daily life tomorrow morning?
The text answers that with a concept the sources call active watchfulness.
Using the fig tree analogy.
Exactly. When you observe a fig tree in the spring and see the branches becoming tender, the leaves pushing out, you don't need a formal calendar to tell you summer is approaching.
You intuitively sense the shift in the environment.
Right. The argument here is that discerning believers are supposed to read the cultural and spiritual seasons of the world in the same way, remaining alert to the shifting environment without needing to nail down a specific Tuesday on a calendar.
But alertness isn't the same as paranoia. The study guide brings in a really helpful parable about a hotel owner to illustrate this.
Yes, imagine a wealthy boss goes on a long, indefinite overseas trip and leaves his management staff in charge of the business.
The faithful employees don't abandon their posts to go sit in the lobby staring out the glass doors for months on end waiting to see his cab pull up.
No, they just do their jobs. They manage the hotel. Watchfulness isn't staring idly into the clouds looking for cosmic anomalies. It's faithfully executing your daily assignment while the boss is away.
The psychology of that is profound. It shifts the focus from passive waiting to active stewardship. The lecture provides an incredible historical anecdote that I think perfectly nails this mindset.
Oh, the 1869 sandstorm in the American South. That's a great one.
Right. In the middle of the day, the sky went completely pitch black. People poured into the streets in an absolute panic, screaming that the cosmic signs had arrived and the world was ending. But in one town, there was a judge sitting in his courtroom. Instead of fleeing or panicking, he simply banged his gavel and told the court, "Send for candles."
Send for candles.
He reasoned that if the world was ending, he wanted the Creator to find him faithfully executing his duty at his post. Send for candles so we can keep working.
It strips away the hysteria. The panic is replaced by a grounded sense of purpose.
The study guide also uses the analogy of redecorating a temporary room. If you are placed in a room that you know for an absolute fact is going to be demolished in a few years, you still make the bed, you still sweep the floor, you make the room functional and pleasant because you have to live in it today.
But you don't empty your entire bank account buying custom Italian marble countertops for a building scheduled for demolition.
Exactly. You invest in the present, but you retain an emotional detachment from the permanence of the structure.
Or, as another analogy in the sources suggests, it's like packing for a flight. The night before you travel, you're highly engaged in the present moment. You're folding clothes, checking your passport, zipping the suitcase. But your psychological state has already shifted. You are mentally prepared for departure.
Fully engaged, but ready to leave.
We connect this to the bigger picture. The overarching philosophical argument of these sources is that biblical prophecy is never handed down merely to satisfy human curiosity about the future.
And it is certainly not meant to incite paralyzing fear.
No, it exists entirely to inspire diligent, active stewardship in the present moment.
We have mapped out an incredible landscape today. We started by looking through that prophetic telescope, learning that a single ancient sentence can compress massive, sprawling valleys of human history. We analyzed the terrifying historical reality of AD 70.
where millions perished because they put their trust in the temporary engineering of a building instead of a warning.
Right. We looked at the cosmic scale of the ultimate end, and we unpacked the profound realization that true watchfulness doesn't mean building a bunker or cracking mathematical codes.
It means lighting candles in the dark and getting back to work. It fundamentally reorients how a person interacts with the concept of the future. The future is no longer a source of dread, but the motivation for present faithfulness.
So, if you're listening to this right now, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over as you step back into your daily routine. Think about the massive skyscrapers you are currently constructing in your own life right now. Your career trajectory, your social reputation, your ultimate goals.
The things we assume are permanent.
Right. If you knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that your current environment was just a temporary assignment in that vast valley of time, how would it change your schedule tomorrow morning? What truly permanent things in your life are you currently neglecting simply because you are too busy polishing stones that are eventually going to fall?
That is a profound question to walk away with.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we will see you next time.